There is a moment in every major social shift when the people involved do not realize that history has already turned the page. They are still arguing about the past while the future is already locking itself into place. That moment is now. What we are witnessing today is not a temporary frustration, not a passing trend, and not a mood that will correct itself with time. It is a permanent change in behavior, priorities, and expectations. And once people understand what is happening, they will realize that there is no going back. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what I'm about to lay out explains why so many men have quietly exited relationships, dating, and marriage, and why the damage done over decades cannot be undone with slogans, guilt, or panic. Before we get into it, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. If you want to stay ahead of the curve and hear what most people will only understand years from now, make sure you are locked in. Also, if you are serious about protecting your assets and growing your wealth in an uncertain world, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. It is linked in the description of this video. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to think long term, and how to safeguard what you work for instead of watching it get eroded over time. Go check it out now while you are thinking about it. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on, the research flowing, and the content coming ahead. Now let us talk about what is really happening, because the surface level headlines are missing the point entirely. You have probably seen claims floating around that an overwhelming number of men say they will never get married, never return to dating, and never engage in long-term relationships again. Some people dismiss this as exaggeration or internet noise, but when you look beneath the numbers, what you find is something much deeper and much more serious. It's not about men being bitter, angry, or temporarily frustrated. This is about men reaching a rational conclusion after decades of experience and messaging and outcomes that have consistently punished them for participation. For decades, men were told that they were the problem, not part of the problem, not contributors to dysfunction, but the problem itself. Every failure in relationships was framed as male failure. Every dissatisfaction was framed as male inadequacy. Men were told they needed to change, adapt, improve, do more, earn more, provide more, listen more, tolerate more, and apologize more. There was never a finish line. There was never a point at which society said, "This is enough. You are doing well. You are valued." Instead, the demands escalated while the rewards diminished. At the same time, women were elevated as inherently virtuous, emotionally superior, morally advanced, and deserving of constant accommodation. Men were told to accept this framing as progress. They were told that questioning it made them outdated, insensitive, or defective. Over time, this messaging did not just affect public policy or media narratives, it seeped into everyday interactions. It shaped how arguments played out in relationships, how conflicts were resolved, and how responsibility was assigned. Men learned very quickly that accountability flowed in one direction only. One of the most exhausting realizations men came to was that they could never actually win an argument, not because they were wrong, but because the structure of the argument itself was tilted. Men tend to approach conflict through logic, evidence, and problem solving. Women tend to approach conflict through emotional framing and validation. In a system where feelings are treated as facts and discomfort is treated as harm, logic becomes irrelevant. Men learned that presenting facts did not resolve disagreements, it escalated them. The outcome was always the same. The woman left the argument feeling justified and emotionally discharged, while the man left drained, confused, and blamed. This pattern repeated over and over until men stopped seeing relationships as mutual partnerships and started seeing them as emotional labor contracts with no upside. Women often feel relief after emotional expression, including crying. Men typically experience emotional expression as a sign that something is wrong. This mismatch alone creates a constant imbalance. Add to that a culture that reflexively sides with women in disputes, and you create a dynamic where men learn that silence is safer than honesty and withdrawal is safer than engagement. As years went by, men noticed something else. The promises they were given never materialized. They were told that if they worked hard, played by the rules, respected boundaries, and invested emotionally, they would be rewarded with loyalty, appreciation, and stability. Instead, many experienced the opposite. They were treated as disposable. They were measured not by character, but by utility. When their usefulness declined or when circumstances changed, commitment evaporated. This is when the shift began. Men did not organize protests. They did not stage public demonstrations. They did not argue endlessly online trying to convince anyone. They simply stopped participating. They stopped dating. They stopped pursuing marriage. They stopped initiating conversations. They stopped explaining themselves. They stopped trying to prove their worth. They walked away quietly and discovered something unexpected. Peace, solitude for many men turned out to be calmer than constant negotiation. Financial independence turned out to be safer than shared risk. Personal routines turned out to be more stable than emotional volatility. Men realized that they were giving their energy to systems and people that did not value them. And once that realization set in, it became impossible to unsee it. At the same time, broader economic pressures intensified. Rising costs of living, unstable job markets, and shrinking opportunities made the traditional risk profile of relationships even less attractive. Men began asking very basic questions. What exactly am I gaining here? What am I risking? What happens if this goes wrong? The answers were not encouraging. Legal systems often penalize men in separation scenarios. Social narratives often assume male fault by default. Emotional support for men is minimal. The rational response for many was exit. And what makes this moment different from past cycles is that men are not coming back. In previous generations, men might disengage temporarily and then re enter the system out of hope, pressure, or expectation. This time, men have built entire lives outside of relationships. They have hobbies, businesses, investments, friendships, and routines that do not require a romantic partnership. They are not lonely in the way society expected them to be. They are not desperate. They are not waiting to be rescued from solitude. They are actively choosing it. Meanwhile, many women are expressing confusion and frustration. They were told that men would always adapt. They were told that independence meant never needing men. They were told that the system would provide what men once did, but systems are strained. Costs are rising, support structures are shrinking, and suddenly the absence of men is being felt not emotionally, but materially. This is where the panic begins. Calls for men to step up reappear. Narratives about shared responsibility resurface. Appeals to tradition quietly return under new branding. But the men who left are not moved by these messages because they recognize them as reactive, not sincere. The trust is gone. Trust, once broken at scale, does not regenerate on demand. Another critical shift is how men now view intimacy itself. What was once seen as connection is now viewed through a risk assessment lens. Many men no longer see physical intimacy as worth the potential consequences. When something becomes a liability rather than a benefit, desire fades. This is not repression, it is calculation. When boundaries are unclear and repercussions are unpredictable, avoidance becomes rational. Men also noticed how public spaces changed. Environments that once allowed casual interaction became heavily regulated by suspicion. Gyms, cafes, workplaces, and social venues became zones where a misinterpreted glance or a comment could carry consequences. Men adapted by minimizing exposure. Less interaction meant less risk. Over time, disengagement became habitual. Some women interpreted this withdrawal as punishment or resentment. In reality, it is neither. It is simply optimization. Men optimized for peace, stability, and predictability. They stopped trying to fix systems that showed no interest in fixing themselves. They stopped arguing with narratives that painted them as inherently flawed. They stopped investing where returns were negative. Now we are reaching the stage where the consequences of that withdrawal are impossible to ignore. Birth rates decline, relationship formation slows, social cohesion weakens, and yet, instead of addressing root causes, many continue to moralize the outcome. They ask why men will not return without acknowledging why men left. Some men who still desire relationships have adjusted their strategies entirely. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Rather than trying to rebuild trust in environments where it was broken, they look elsewhere. They seek cultures where expectations are clearer, roles are understood, and mutual respect is not framed as oppression. This is not about superiority, it is about alignment. When alignment disappears, migration follows, whether physical or emotional. What we are seeing is not a rebellion, it is a resignation. Men did not storm the gates. They closed the door behind them and built something quieter. The silence you hear now is not confusion, it is resolution. And this is only the beginning of the story, because once a large enough percentage of men opt out permanently, the structure of society itself begins to change in ways that no policy or campaign can easily reverse. And once you understand that this withdrawal is intentional and permanent for many men, a lot of current confusion suddenly makes sense. Society keeps asking why men are disengaging as if the answer is hidden, but the answer has been stated repeatedly and ignored repeatedly. Men are not leaving because they hate women. Men are leaving because the cost of participation steadily increased while the benefits steadily decreased, and eventually the math stopped working. No ideology can override lived experience forever. When men compare the peace of their current lives with the stress of their past relationships, the comparison is not even close. What is rarely acknowledged is how long men tried before they walked away. This was not an overnight decision. This was the result of years of adapting, apologizing, compromising, and recalibrating themselves to fit expectations that kept shifting. Men were told to be more open, then criticized for vulnerability. They were told to lead, then accused of control. They were told to listen, then blamed for not fixing emotional dissatisfaction. Each adjustment created a new complaint. Each concession moved the goalpost further away. Eventually, men recognized the pattern and stopped playing the game. One of the most corrosive aspects of this dynamic was the normalization of contempt. Disrespect toward men was reframed as empowerment. Dismissive language became acceptable. Mockery became entertainment. Male frustration was treated as entitlement rather than exhaustion. Over time, men internalized the message that their discomfort did not matter. When people realize they are not allowed to have limits, they stop offering access entirely. Another factor that accelerated the shift was the collapse of honest dialogue. Men learned that expressing concerns often led to labels rather than discussion. Questioning norms became grounds for dismissal. Instead of addressing issues, conversations shut down. This did not create harmony, it created silence. Silence, unlike argument, is final. When men stopped speaking, many assumed compliance. In reality, it was departure. Economic realities also played a critical role. The expectation that men should still provide stability in an unstable system became increasingly unreasonable. Men were told to be traditional without receiving traditional respect or authority. They were expected to shoulder risk without influence. This arrangement is unsustainable in any context. Rational actors do not accept unlimited liability with limited agency. As men stepped back, many discovered that much of the pressure they lived under was not natural, but socially imposed. Without constant scrutiny, they slept better. Without emotional turbulence, their focus improved. Without relationship conflict, their finances stabilized. These outcomes reinforced their decision. Peace became the baseline rather than the exception. What unsettles many observers is not that men left, but that men are not miserable after leaving. The assumption was that men would collapse without relationships, become isolated, and seek reintegration. Instead, many men flourished quietly. They redirected energy into personal growth, skill building, health, and long term planning. They learned that fulfillment does not require constant validation from another person. This challenges a long standing narrative that men need relationships more than women do. In reality, men need purpose and stability. Relationships can complement that, but they are not the sole source of meaning. When relationships undermine those foundations, men choose the foundation. Another uncomfortable truth is that men no longer feel responsible for saving systems that rejected them. For years, men were told they were unnecessary. Now, that claim is being tested as economic pressures increase and institutional support weakens. The absence of men becomes more visible. Yet appeals to duty ring hollow when duty was previously framed as oppression. The emotional tone of these appeals also matters. Men hear frustration, not accountability. They hear demands, not reflection. They hear urgency, not remorse. Trust cannot be rebuilt through panic. Trust requires acknowledgement of harm, and that acknowledgement has largely not happened. A particularly revealing moment came when surveys and social discussions revealed how some women viewed men in general. When men heard themselves described as threats rather than partners, risks rather than allies, they adjusted accordingly. If you are treated as dangerous by default, distance becomes the safest option for everyone involved. Men did not argue this point endlessly. They simply accepted the premise and removed themselves. You cannot ask people to participate enthusiastically in systems that assume their guilt. Withdrawal is not hostility, it is self preservation. This has led to a paradox that few are willing to address. The more men disengage, the louder the calls for their return become. But those calls often lack substance. They ask for presence without offering protection. They ask for effort without offering respect. They ask for sacrifice without offering security. These are not compelling incentives. Some commentators claim that men will eventually return out of biological or emotional necessity. This misunderstands the scale of adaptation taking place. Men are not waiting, they are building lives that do not revolve around romantic validation. They are finding meaning in mastery, contribution, and autonomy. These sources of fulfillment are durable. It is also important to understand that men did not arrive at this conclusion as a group. They arrived at it independently. That is what makes it resilient. There is no leader to discredit. There is no movement to dismantle. There is simply a widespread alignment of individual decisions. Technology also played a role. Access to information allowed men to compare experiences and recognize patterns that were previously isolated. What once felt like personal failure was revealed to be systemic. Recognition reduces shame. Reduced shame reduces compliance. Men also began to question narratives that portrayed their withdrawal as a crisis rather than a choice. Framing male disengagement as a problem to be solved misses the point. It is not a bug. It is a feature of the system as it currently exists. When participation becomes costly, participation declines. Some argue that this shift harms society as a whole. That may be true, but harm alone does not compel participation. Responsibility requires reciprocity. Without it, appeals fall flat. There's also a generational component. Younger men watched older men struggle, compromise, and suffer consequences despite doing what they were told was right. That observation shaped their choices early. Many decided not to repeat the experiment. Learning from others is not bitterness, it is intelligence. As a result, many younger men never fully entered the dating system at all. They bypassed it. They saw instability and opted out before becoming invested. This makes re engagement even less likely. You cannot return to something you never joined. When critics accuse men of giving up, they misunderstand the mindset. Men did not give up on life, they gave up on a specific arrangement that no longer served them. Letting go of a bad investment is not failure, it is course correction. Another overlooked aspect is how male friendships evolved in the absence of romantic focus. Men strengthened bonds with peers, built communities around shared interests, and supported each other without romantic expectations. These networks provided support that was previously assumed to come only from partners, and this further reduced the perceived need for romantic involvement. When emotional and social needs are met elsewhere, pressure dissipates. Men realized they could have connection without complication. The question many now ask is whether the situation can be reversed. The honest answer is that large scale reversal is unlikely. Once trust erodes across a population, rebuilding it requires profound cultural change, not messaging. That change would require accountability, humility, and structural reform. So far, those signals are absent. Instead, much of the discourse focuses on persuading men to return without changing the conditions that drove them away. That approach will not work. Men are not confused, they are convinced. What remains is adjustment. Society will adapt to the absence of male participation in certain areas, just as men adapted to exclusion and pressure. The adaptation will not be painless, but it will be real. Some will label this outcome as tragic, others will call it inevitable. From the male perspective, it is simply the result of choices made over time. Choices have consequences. This is one of of them, and still, many men express no hostility. They do not seek revenge. They do not celebrate hardship. They simply focus on their own lives. That quiet indifference is more telling than anger ever could be. The silence is not a phase. It is the sound of people who have moved on. As this quiet disengagement becomes more visible, something interesting happens in public discourse. The narrative begins to fracture. On one side, there are those who still insist this is a temporary imbalance that will correct itself once men mature, settle down, or feel enough pressure. On the other side are men who already passed through that phase and emerged on the other side, calmer, more focused, and uninterested in returning. The problem for the first group is that pressure only works when the target believes there is something to gain by complying. Men who have rebuilt their lives outside of relationships do not feel pressure in the same way. They feel distance. Another mistake many make is assuming that disengaged men are emotionally numb or disconnected. In reality, many are more emotionally regulated than they have ever been. They are no longer living in a constant state of negotiation, second guessing, or self monitoring. Emotional regulation improves when chaos is removed. This does not mean men lack empathy or compassion. It means they have learned to prioritize environments that do not punish them for being stable. What also becomes clear is that many men were not avoiding commitment itself, they were avoiding unpredictability. Commitment to work, craft, fitness, or long term goals feels rewarding because effort reliably leads to progress. In many relationships, effort led to moving expectations instead. Over time, men internalized the lesson that consistency was not valued, only escalation. When stability is treated as stagnation, people who value stability leave. There is also a psychological cost that rarely gets discussed. Constantly being told that your natural tendencies are wrong erodes self trust. Men were instructed to suppress instincts while simultaneously being criticized for lacking confidence or direction. This contradiction creates internal friction. Walking away resolved that friction almost instantly. Without competing demands, men could align actions with values again. As disengagement increased, some institutions attempted to compensate by reframing men's absence as irrelevant. The idea that society could function the same without male participation was repeated often. Yet, behind the scenes, practical challenges mounted. Declining participation in physically demanding work, reduced willingness to assume long term risk, and shrinking volunteer bases revealed gaps that could not be filled by slogans. What makes the situation difficult to address is that there is no villain in the traditional sense. There is no single policy, law, or event to blame. This was a cumulative outcome of cultural incentives applied over time. When you reward certain behaviors and punish others consistently, you shape behavior predictably. Men responded exactly as incentives suggested they should. Some still argue that men owe participation regardless of incentives, framing involvement as a moral obligation. This framing collapses under scrutiny. Obligation without consent is coercion. Men recognized this and rejected it. Consent matters in all areas of life, including social contracts. When consent is withdrawn, the contract dissolves. It is also worth noting that many men did not leave with resentment. They left with clarity. Resentment fades when people stop trying to extract validation from places that deny it. What remains is acceptance. Acceptance does not seek permission or understanding. It simply moves forward. As men rebuilt their lives, they also adjusted expectations of happiness rather than chasing constant excitement or validation. Many prioritized calm, routine, and autonomy. This shift reduced anxiety dramatically. Happiness became quieter, but more durable. That trade off appealed to men who had experienced emotional volatility firsthand. Another layer to this shift is how men redefined success. Success was no longer measured by relationship status or social approval. It was measured by freedom of time, control over finances, and alignment between effort and outcome. These metrics are internal, not performative. They cannot be taken away by external judgment. This internalization of standards made men less susceptible to shaming. Shame relies on shared values. When values diverge, shame loses power. Men who no longer measure themselves by romantic success cannot be shamed for lacking it. This frustrates those who rely on social pressure to enforce norms. Meanwhile, discussions about loneliness often miss a crucial distinction. Being alone is not the same as being lonely. Loneliness is distress caused by unwanted isolation. Many men are alone by choice. That choice transforms the experience entirely. Choice restores agency. Agency restores dignity. This distinction explains why warnings about male loneliness often fail to resonate. Men who chose solitude do not feel warned. They feel understood only by those who have made the same choice. External concern feels misplaced when internal well being has improved. The conversation also shifts when men begin to speak less and observe more. Silence allows patterns to emerge without interference. Men noticed how often responsibility was externalized, how rarely accountability flowed upward, how quickly narratives changed when consequences appeared. These observations reinforced disengagement rather than challenging it. One particularly revealing pattern was how often men were told to listen, but rarely felt heard. Listening became our one way requirement. When communication lacks reciprocity, it ceases to be communication. It becomes compliance training. Men opted out of that process. As disengagement stabilized, Men also became more selective about where they invested emotionally. Many redirected care toward family members, aging parents, or younger men seeking guidance. This redistributed emotional labor into contexts where it was appreciated and respected. Fulfillment increased accordingly. This redirection also exposed another misconception. Emotional labor itself is not the problem. Being taken for granted is. Men are willing to invest emotionally when investment leads to mutual benefit. When it leads to escalation or entitlement, withdrawal follows. The cultural reaction to male withdrawal often focuses on surface behaviors rather than underlying causes. Dating app statistics, declining marriage rates, and demographic trends are analyzed endlessly, but the emotional logic behind them is ignored. Numbers describe outcomes, they do not explain decisions. Men's decisions are rooted in pattern recognition. When a pattern produces negative outcomes consistently, intelligent actors adjust behavior. Calling that adjustment a crisis misunderstands its nature. It is adaptation. Some believe that time alone will reverse this trend as memories fade. This assumes that conditions will improve organically, yet many underlying dynamics remain unchanged. Without structural change, time only entrenches habits. Men who have lived peacefully for years are unlikely to re enter chaos voluntarily. Another overlooked element is that men now have models for alternative lives. Previous generations had fewer visible examples of men thriving outside traditional roles. Today, examples are everywhere. Visibility normalizes alternatives. Normalization reduces fear. Reduced fear enables choice. A choice is the central theme here. Men chose to leave. They chose peace. They chose autonomy. These choices were not impulsive, they were deliberate responses to long term conditions. Reversing them requires altering conditions, not criticizing choices. There is also a moral dimension that deserves examination. For years, men were told that self sacrifice was virtuous and self interest was suspect. As men observed outcomes, they reconsidered this framing. They realized that self preservation is not selfish, it is necessary. No one thrives while constantly depleted. This realization also affected how men view compromise. Compromise is meaningful when both parties give and receive. When compromise becomes unilateral, it becomes erosion. Men stopped confusing erosion with growth. As more men disengage, a new equilibrium forms, expectations adjust, systems recalibrate. Not everything breaks, some things simply change shape. The idea that society will collapse without male participation underestimates adaptability. But adaptation does not equal restoration. What cannot be restored easily is trust. Trust is built slowly and destroyed quickly. Rebuilding it requires sustained demonstration, not rhetoric. It requires accountability, not reassurance. It requires structural fairness and not symbolic gestures. Until those appear, disengagement remains rational. Men understand this intuitively. They do not need studies to validate it, they lived it. Experience is the most persuasive data set. This brings us to a critical realization. Many men are not waiting for permission to return. They are not seeking apology. They are not demanding reform. They have accepted the current reality and optimized within it. That acceptance is what makes the shift durable. Acceptance does not seek closure, it creates it. As a result, future discussions about relationships will increasingly occur without male input. Men will not argue their case, they will simply not show up. This absence will shape outcomes more than debate ever could. The challenge ahead is not convincing men to return, it is understanding what a society looks like when a large portion of men no longer orient their lives around relationships. That society will have different rhythms, different incentives, and different priorities. Whether that future is embraced or resisted is irrelevant. It is already forming. Men did not plan this transformation, they responded to it. And response, when consistent and widespread, becomes direction. As this new reality settles in, another misunderstanding becomes clear. Many assume that men who disengage are rejecting connection altogether, but that is not what is happening. What men are rejecting is imbalance. They are rejecting systems where effort flows in one direction and accountability flows in none. They are rejecting environments where they are constantly evaluated but rarely appreciated. Once you understand that distinction, the behavior no longer seems extreme. It seems logical. Men did not stop believing in cooperation. They stopped believing in asymmetry disguised as fairness. Cooperation requires reciprocity. When reciprocity disappears, cooperation becomes compliance. Men recognized this and opted out before compliance became their permanent role. One of the most revealing aspects of the shift is how little noise accompanied it. There were no mass announcements, no dramatic exits, no ultimatums. Men simply withdrew attention, energy, and resources. That quiet withdrawal is powerful because it does not invite negotiation. It does not seek validation. It just changes outcomes. In the past, male dissatisfaction often expressed itself through frustration or confrontation. Today, it expresses itself through absence. Absence cannot be argued with. You cannot shame someone who is not present. You cannot demand explanations from someone who has already moved on. This is why so many public conversations feel disconnected from reality. They are arguing with ghosts. They are responding to behaviors that no longer exist. The men they are trying to persuade are not listening because persuasion is no longer relevant to their lives. Another shift that deserves attention is how men now approach time. Time has become their most guarded resource. After years of emotional labor and unreciprocated effort, men learn to protect their time fiercely. They allocate it where it produces peace, growth, or tangible progress. Relationships that demand constant maintenance without stability do not meet that threshold. This reframing of time also reshaped how men define productivity. Productivity is no longer about pleasing others. It is about improving personal systems. Men invest time in health, skill acquisition, financial literacy, and long term planning because these investments compound. Emotional chaos does not compound, it drains. As men adopted this mindset, they also became less reactive to social narratives. They no longer feel compelled to defend themselves against broad accusations or stereotypes. Defense requires engagement. Engagement implies relevance. By disengaging, men deprive those narratives of fuel. This is not apathy, it is boundary enforcement. Boundaries are most effective when they are quietly upheld rather than loudly announced. Men learn this through experience. Arguing boundaries invites debate. Living boundaries ends discussion. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men now view romantic conflict as unnecessary friction. Conflict can be productive when it leads to resolution. But when conflict is cyclical and unresolved, it becomes a liability. Men learn to recognize the difference. They stopped confusing intensity with intimacy. This clarity also altered how men perceive compromise. Healthy compromise strengthens trust. Unbalanced compromise weakens identity. Men who compromised repeatedly without seeing mutual adjustment eventually stopped compromising at all, not out of stubbornness, but out of self preservation. Some observers misinterpret this as emotional withdrawal. In reality, it is emotional discipline. Men are choosing environments where emotional investment produces stability rather than volatility. This is not avoidance, it is selection. As more men adopt this approach, social expectations begin to shift subtly. What was once considered unusual becomes normal. Single men living fulfilled lives become common rather than exceptional. This normalization further reduces pressure to conform, and pressure relies on isolation. When people see others thriving outside prescribed paths, pressure loses effectiveness. Men no longer feel alone in their choices. That shared visibility reinforces confidence. Another factor reinforcing disengagement is the absence of meaningful incentive to return. Incentives matter. In any system, participants evaluate risk versus reward. When risks are high and rewards are uncertain, participation declines. This principle applies universally. Relationships are not exempt. Some attempt to frame re engagement as a moral duty rather than a rational choice. But moral arguments lose power when outcomes consistently contradict them. Men watched good intentions lead to negative consequences too many times to accept morality without evidence. This skepticism does not mean men lack values. It means their values are grounded in outcomes rather than promises. They judge systems by how they function, not how they are described. Another shift worth noting is how men now process public criticism. In the past, criticism often triggered introspection and self correction. Today, criticism is often dismissed as noise. This is not arrogance, it is pattern recognition. When criticism is constant and contradictory, it loses instructional value. Men learned that changing behavior rarely reduced criticism. So they stopped trying to appease critics and focused instead on self defined standards. This internal locus of evaluation is a hallmark of psychological maturity. As men moved inward for validation, external approval lost significance. Likes, praise, and approval became secondary to alignment. Alignment feels better than applause. Applause fades. Alignment sustains. This internal shift also affected how men view responsibility. They take responsibility for what they can control and release responsibility for what they cannot. Relationships require shared control. When control is uneven, responsibility becomes burdensome. Men release that burden. This does not mean men reject responsibility entirely. They embrace responsibility where authority and accountability are balanced. Work, personal development, and self discipline offer that balance. Romantic dynamics often did not. As disengagement continues, new questions emerge about long term social structure. How will communities function when fewer men participate in traditional family formation? How will social support systems adapt? How will cultural expectations evolve? These questions matter, but they do not motivate individual men to return. Collective outcomes rarely override personal well being. People prioritize immediate lived experience over abstract future concerns. This is human nature, not male specific behavior. Men also notice that appeals for their return often lack self examination. The focus was on male behavior rather than systemic incentives. Without addressing incentives, behavior will not change. This is basic behavioral economics. Some suggest that improved messaging could solve the issue. Messaging cannot override lived experience. Men do not disengage because they misunderstood relationships. They disengaged because they understood them clearly. Another pattern that emerged is how men reevaluated emotional safety. Emotional safety requires predictability, respect, and trust. When these are absent, withdrawal is rational. Men prioritized environments where emotional safety was not conditional. This recalibration also affected how men approach vulnerability. Vulnerability without protection is exposure. Men learned that lesson the hard way. They now reserve vulnerability for contexts where it is respected. This selectivity is not emotional shutdown, it is discernment. Discernment grows with experience. Younger men are learning this faster than previous generations because they have access to shared knowledge. Stories that once remained private are now public. Patterns are easier to see. Lessons are learned earlier. As a result, disengagement begins sooner. Men opt out before investing deeply. This front loaded caution reduces future regret. It also reduces emotional entanglement. Prevention replaces recovery. Some criticize this as fear driven. It is not fear, it is foresight. Fear reacts, foresight anticipates. Men are anticipating outcomes based on observed patterns. That is rational behavior. Another aspect that deserves attention is how men define fairness. Fairness is not sameness, it is proportionality. Men observed systems where proportionality was absent. Contributions were not matched by consideration. Sacrifices were not reciprocated by security. Fairness eroded. When fairness erodes, trust follows. Trust once lost is difficult to regain. Men internalized this and adjusted expectations accordingly. The adjustment is not temporary, it is reinforced daily by lived experience. Every peaceful day strengthens the decision. Every stable routine confirms it. Every avoided conflict reinforces it. This is why calls for urgency often fail. Men do not feel urgency, they feel relief. Relief is a powerful stabilizer. People rarely abandon relief voluntarily. As more men settle into this equilibrium, social narratives will continue to lag behind reality. Narratives change slowly, behavior changes quickly. Eventually, narratives adjust, but only after outcomes become undeniable. And we are approaching that point. The disconnect between expectation and reality is widening. The question is not whether men will return. The question is how society will adapt to their absence. Adaptation does not require agreement, it requires acceptance. Acceptance begins when denial ends. Men reached acceptance quietly. They did not ask permission, they did not wait for consensus, they adjusted individually. And those individual adjustments aggregated into a collective shift. That shift is now visible. And once a shift becomes visible, it becomes permanent. As this permanence becomes undeniable, the discussion shifts again, this time toward adaptation rather than persuasion. The focus quietly moves from how to bring men back to how to function without their participation in traditional roles. This shift itself is revealing. When systems stop trying to retain participants and start trying to compensate for their absence, it signals an acceptance that something fundamental has changed. Men see this clearly and it reinforces their choice rather than undermining it. What many still fail to grasp is that men did not disengage because they lacked options. They disengaged because they evaluated the options available and found them lacking. This distinction matters. A lack of options creates desperation. An abundance of options paired with discernment creates selectivity. Men today are selective not because they fear commitment, but because they understand cost. Cost is not just financial, it is emotional, psychological, and temporal. Men learned that the most expensive commitments are often the ones that promise fulfillment but deliver instability. Once that lesson is learned deeply, it reshapes priorities permanently. Another aspect that deserves attention is how disengaged men relate to society more broadly. They have not withdrawn from contribution altogether. Many still work, innovate, mentor, and build. What they have withdrawn from is unpaid emotional labor and unreciprocated obligation. This distinction is often ignored by critics who frame disengagement as irresponsibility. Responsibility without authority is exploitation. Men recognized this pattern early in their personal lives and later saw it mirrored in social expectations. Opting out became a way to reclaim agency. As agency returned, so did confidence. A confidence rooted in self trust rather than external validation is stable. It does not fluctuate based on approval. It does not require constant reinforcement. This kind of confidence makes men resistant to manipulation through guilt or praise. One of the more ironic outcomes of this shift is that men who disengaged often became more emotionally steady than they were before. Without constant relational turbulence, their nervous system settled, stress levels dropped, Decision making improved. These changes are subtle but profound. Once experienced, they are difficult to surrender. This physiological component is rarely discussed, yet it plays a crucial role. Chronic stress changes perception. When stress is removed, clarity emerges. Many men realize that what they once interpreted as personal inadequacy was actually environmental strain. Changing the environment resolved the issue. This realization also altered how men interpret past advice. Many recommendations that once sounded reasonable now appear incomplete or misguided. Advice that ignores structural incentives cannot produce lasting solutions. Men learn this through lived outcomes rather than theory. Another misconception is that disengaged men are closed off to future change. In reality, they are open to systems that demonstrate fairness consistently over time. What they are closed off to are promises without proof. Trust now requires evidence. Well, evidence is cumulative. One positive interaction does not offset years of negative patterns. Men understand this intuitively. They evaluate trends, not moments. This long view makes them patient but firm. As men adopted this perspective, their tolerance for chaos diminished sharply. Chaos consumes energy without producing value. Men began optimizing for predictability, even when predictability meant less excitement. Excitement without stability lost its appeal. This optimization also affected how men view compromise at a societal level. Compromise requires mutual concession. When compromise becomes expectation rather than exchange, it ceases to function. Men disengaged from conversations where outcomes were predetermined regardless of input. Another development is the reframing of masculinity itself. Rather than defining masculinity through relational success, men increasingly define it through competence, integrity, and self governance. These traits are internally verifiable, they do not depend on approval. This reframing reduces vulnerability to social pressure. When identity is internally anchored, external criticism loses leverage. Men who reach this stage stopped explaining themselves. Explanation implies justification. Justification implies obligation. Men no longer felt obligated. As explanation ceased, narratives filled the gap. Those narratives often mischaracterize disengaged men as fearful, bitter, or damaged. These characterizations persist because they serve existing frameworks. They do not reflect lived reality. Men are largely indifferent to these narratives. Indifference is a sign that the narratives no longer influence behavior. Influence requires emotional investment. Men have withdrawn that investment. Another area where this shift is visible is in how men approach risk. They are more willing to take calculated risks in business or personal development than in relationships. This is because outcomes in business are governed by clearer rules. Effort correlates more directly with reward. When systems provide transparency, participation increases. When systems obscure accountability, participation declines. This principle explains much of male disengagement without invoking ideology. Men also began questioning assumptions about fulfillment. The idea that romantic partnership is the primary path to meaning was examined and found wanting. Meaning was rediscovered in mastery, contribution, and autonomy. These sources are reliable. This reevaluation does not imply hostility toward relationships. It implies realism. Relationships are one possible source of fulfillment, not a guaranteed one. When they fail to deliver consistently, alternatives gain appeal. Another reinforcing factor is the reduced stigma around singlehood. As more men choose this path openly, stigma erodes. What was once considered abnormal becomes accepted. Acceptance reduces friction. Reduced friction sustains behavior. Men also benefit from the fact that disengagement requires no coordination. It spreads naturally because it aligns with incentives. No leader needs to organize it. No ideology needs to promote it. Individual choices aggregate organically. This organic nature makes disengagement resilient. It cannot be dismantled through counter messaging because it is not driven by belief. It is driven by experience. Experience is stubborn. It does not respond to persuasion easily. Men trust their own outcomes more than external assurances. This trust in self observation is the foundation of disengagement. As this foundation solidifies, re engagement becomes less likely even if conditions improve slightly. Trust requires sustained improvement over time. Men will not re enter based on temporary shifts or isolated examples. This long memory is often misinterpreted as unforgiving. It is simply cautious. Caution is adaptive, it reduces exposure to harm. Men learned caution the same way people learn any survival skill, through repetition. Repetition leaves marks. Another subtle shift is how men view compromise between peace and connection. Many concluded that peace outweighs connection when connection threatens peace. This hierarchy may change in the future, but it will not reverse easily. Peace, once experienced, becomes non negotiable. People protect what stabilizes them. Men are no different. This protection extends to emotional boundaries. Men are more likely to disengage early rather than attempt to repair later. Early disengagement minimizes damage. This preventative approach is efficient. Critics often frame this as avoidance. It is not. It is selection based on pattern recognition. Avoidance implies fear. Selection implies discernment. Discernment improves with age and experience. That is why disengagement spans generations. Older men arrive there after experience. Younger men arrive there through observation. Observation accelerates learning. Men no longer need to fail personally to understand outcomes. They watch others, they adjust preemptively. This preemptive adjustment reduces conflict. It also reduces participation. Fewer men enter systems that appear misaligned. As participation declines, systems face pressure to change. Whether they do remains to be seen. Pressure alone does not guarantee reform. What is certain is that men will not return to environments that remain unchanged. Adaptation flows both ways. Men adapted already. The remaining question is not whether disengagement will continue. It will. The question is how visible it will become as effects compound. Visibility changes conversation. Conversation changes expectations. Expectations change behavior. We are in the middle of that transition now. And transitions, once underway, rarely reverse direction. As this transition progresses, another subtle but critical shift takes place in how men interpret social messaging. Messages that once carried weight now feel hollow because they no longer align with lived outcomes. When words repeatedly conflict with experience, credibility erodes. Men stopped reacting emotionally to messaging because it no longer shaped their reality. Their reality was shaped by what happened when they participated and what happened when they stepped away. The contrast was instructive. This erosion of credibility extends beyond relationships into institutions more broadly. Men noticed that many systems functioned on expectation rather than reciprocity. Participation was framed as duty, while dissent was framed as defect. Over time, men recognized that disengagement was the only lever available to them. Voice had been exhausted, exit remained. Exit is often misinterpreted as weakness, but in many systems, it is the strongest form of feedback. When people stop showing up, the system is forced to confront reality rather than narrative. Men did not exit to send a message, they exited to protect themselves. The message was a byproduct. As disengagement stabilized, men also became less reactive to crisis framing. Headlines declaring emergencies in dating or marriage rates did not move them. Crisis language loses power when people no longer feel personally endangered. Men felt safer outside the system than inside it. That perception neutralized urgency. This lack of urgency is unsettling for those who rely on pressure to produce compliance. Pressure requires fear of loss. Men no longer fear losing access to something they voluntarily abandoned. That changes the dynamic entirely. Another element reinforcing disengagement is how men now evaluate advice. Advice that once sounded reasonable now triggers skepticism. Men ask a simple question before accepting guidance. Does this advice acknowledge risk? If not, it is dismissed. Advice that ignores downside is incomplete. This analytical lens sharpened over time. Men began applying it to every aspect of life. Work, finances, health, and relationships were all evaluated through the same framework. If risk was asymmetric and mitigation absent, engagement declined. This framework also exposed contradictions in cultural expectations. Men were encouraged to be emotionally open, yet punished when vulnerability complicated dynamics. They were encouraged to invest deeply, yet blamed when investment created dependency. These contradictions were not resolved through dialogue, they were resolved through withdrawal. Withdrawal removed men from contradictory demands. Without conflicting expectations, clarity returned. Clarity is calming. Calm reinforces decision making. The cycle became self sustaining. As men settled into this clarity, their tolerance for ambiguity decreased. Ambiguity creates anxiety. Systems that rely on ambiguity to shift responsibility lose participants over time. Men gravitated toward environments with defined rules and predictable outcomes. This gravitation explains why many disengaged men still thrive professionally. Work environments with clear expectations and measurable outcomes feel safer than personal environments governed by shifting norms. Predictability fosters trust. Trust fosters engagement. Where trust is absent, engagement fades. This principle is consistent across domains. Men simply applied it to relationships after seeing it work elsewhere. Another overlooked shift is how men now view compromise narratives. Compromise used to be framed as maturity. Men eventually realized that maturity includes knowing when compromise becomes self erasure. This realization reframed walking away as strength rather than failure. Strength is often misunderstood as endurance. Endurance without purpose is depletion. Men learned to distinguish between resilience and stagnation. They stopped enduring what did not lead anywhere. As this understanding spread, men became less impressed by symbolic gestures. Gestures without structural change felt cosmetic. Men learned to wait for consistent patterns rather than reacting to isolated improvements. Consistency matters more than intensity. A single positive experience does not outweigh years of negative reinforcement. Men evaluate trajectories, not snapshots. This trajectory based thinking also altered how men process regret. Many men initially questioned whether disengagement meant giving up on potential fulfillment. Over time, that question faded as fulfillment appeared elsewhere. Regret requires comparison. When the alternative life is satisfying, regret loses relevance. And this satisfaction does not always look dramatic, it often looks quiet. Stable routines, manageable stress, and personal progress may not be glamorous, but they are sustainable. Sustainability became a priority. Sustainability also shaped how men view future planning. Many began planning lives that did not assume partnership. Financial planning, housing decisions, and lifestyle choices were adjusted accordingly. Independence became embedded rather than provisional. This embedding makes reversal unlikely. People rarely dismantle stable systems they built carefully. Men who structured their lives around autonomy will not casually restructure them around uncertainty. Another dynamic reinforcing disengagement is how men observe reactions to their absence. Instead of curiosity or reflection, they often see blame or disbelief. These reactions confirm their original assessment that accountability is lacking. Confirmation reinforces disengagement. Men also noticed that calls for their return often framed men as resources rather than partners. Language matters. When men feel valued primarily for what they provide rather than who they are, motivation evaporates. Value recognition is foundational. Without it, engagement feels transactional. Men rejected transaction that offered little in return. This rejection also affected how men view intimacy narratives. Intimacy framed as obligation rather than choice loses appeal. Men now prioritize consent not just in action, but in expectation. If participation is assumed rather than invited, interest declines. Invitation implies appreciation. Assumption implies entitlement. Men respond to the former and withdraw from the latter. As this mindset spread, men also became more comfortable declining invitations without explanation. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites pressure. Men chose peace over persuasion. This shift in communication style further reduced conflict. Conflict often arises from unmet expectations. When men stopped signaling availability, expectations adjusted. Reduced expectation reduced friction. This reduction in friction improved overall well being. Men noticed fewer emotional spikes, fewer arguments, and fewer disruptions. These improvements reinforced disengagement more effectively than any ideology ever could. Another misconception is that disengaged men are cynical. Cynicism implies bitterness. Most disengaged men are pragmatic. They are not pessimistic about life. They are realistic about specific systems. Pragmatism does not seek validation, it seeks functionality. Men chose what functioned. As disengagement became normalized, men also became less defensive about it. They no longer felt the need to justify their choices. Justification is often a sign of insecurity. Confidence does not require explanation. This confidence unsettles observers who expect guilt or doubt. When men appear calm and content, it contradicts narratives that predicted despair. That contradiction is uncomfortable. Rather than reassessing assumptions, many double down on existing narratives. This further alienates men who see doubling down as refusal to learn. Alienation reinforces disengagement. Alienation does not require hostility, it requires mismatch. Men recognized mismatch and adjusted accordingly. Another layer to the shift is how men now view sacrifice. Sacrifice without appreciation feels exploitative. Men became unwilling to sacrifice indefinitely for uncertain outcomes. This boundary is rational. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. Men filtered out arrangements that did not meet minimum criteria for fairness and stability. As filtering increased, participation declined. This decline is not an accident, it is a consequence. Consequences often arrive long after causes. When they arrive, they feel sudden, but they are the result of accumulation. We are witnessing accumulation now. Years of messaging, incentives, and outcomes have produced a predictable result. Men opted out. Opting out does not mean opting against, it means opting elsewhere. Elsewhere looks different for different men. Some invest in careers, some focus on health, some build communities, some explore creative pursuits. Diversity of paths reduces dependence on any single system. Reduced dependence increases leverage. Leverage changes dynamics. Men who do not need to participate cannot be compelled. This is the quiet power of disengagement. It removes leverage from systems that relied on assumption. As leverage shifts, conversations will continue to change. Expectations will adjust. New norms will emerge. Those norms will not mirror the past. They will reflect new realities. Men are already living in those realities, and they are not looking back. As we reach the end of this discussion, it becomes clear that what many people are calling a crisis is actually a conclusion. Conclusions are uncomfortable because they force acceptance rather than debate. For men who have stepped away from dating, marriage, and long term relationships, the decision has already been made and reinforced through lived experience. This is not theory, not ideology, and not a temporary emotional reaction. It is the result of years of observation, participation, and recalibration. Once men recognized that their peace increased when they disengaged, the question stopped being whether they should return and became why they ever stayed so long. One of the most important truths to understand is that men did not arrive here out of hatred or resentment. Hatred consumes energy, and disengaged men are conserving energy. They are not focused on fighting narratives, correcting perceptions, or winning arguments. They are focused on building lives that are stable, predictable, and aligned with their values. That alignment is something many men had not experienced before stepping away. And once they found it, it became non negotiable. This non negotiability is what makes the shift permanent. People can be persuaded to compromise when they feel uncertain or dissatisfied. They cannot be persuaded when they feel settled. Settled does not mean stagnant, it means grounded. Men who are grounded are not searching for external validation. They are not looking to be convinced. They are not waiting for permission to live differently. They are already doing it. Another reality that must be acknowledged is that this disengagement is not loud enough to be dramatic, but it is widespread enough to be decisive. Quiet trends often reshape societies more profoundly than noisy movements. There is no rally to attend, no manifesto to read, and no leader to discredit. There are just millions of individual decisions pointing in the same direction. That kind of alignment does not reverse easily because it does not depend on coordination. As this alignment continues, the cultural lag becomes more apparent. Expectations formed in a different era collide with behaviors shaped by new conditions. People continue to ask questions that assume men are waiting to be convinced, corrected, or coaxed. Men are not waiting, they are living. That gap between assumption and reality will continue to widen until the assumptions finally give way. It is also important to recognize that disengagement does not mean men have abandoned meaning, purpose, or connection. They have simply relocated those things into spaces where effort produces return and boundaries are respected. Men are forming friendships, mentoring younger men, supporting family members, and contributing to projects that matter to them. They did not become detached from humanity, they detached from imbalance. This distinction matters because it reframes the narrative entirely. Men are not rejecting relationships as a concept. They are rejecting arrangements that demand sacrifice without security and compromise without reciprocity. When framed this way, the behavior stops looking extreme and starts looking rational. What often goes unspoken is how much emotional maturity this decision actually requires. Walking away from a deeply ingrained social expectation takes clarity, restraint, and self trust. It is far easier to follow a script than to write a new one. Men who disengaged chose the harder path initially so that life could be easier later. That trade was deliberate. This also explains why many men are unresponsive to emotional appeals or urgent messaging. Urgency assumes scarcity. Men no longer feel scarcity in this area of life. They feel sufficiency. Sufficiency is powerful. It quiets anxiety. It reduces impulsiveness. It creates patience. Patience changes everything. Patient people are difficult to manipulate. They do not rush toward promises. They wait for patterns. Men learned to wait for patterns because patterns are what shape their decisions in the first place. A single good interaction does not outweigh years of inconsistency. Men understand this intuitively. As a result, even if conditions were to improve, re engagement would be slow and selective. Trust would need to be rebuilt incrementally over time. That process cannot be accelerated through pressure or messaging. It can only occur through consistent behavior. Until then, disengagement remains the safest option. Another factor that solidifies this outcome is how men now define fulfillment. Fulfillment is no longer tied to approval, status, or conformity. It is tied to autonomy, competence, and inner calm. These qualities are self reinforcing. They do not depend on external systems functioning well. That independence makes men resilient. Resilience reduces dependence. Reduced dependence changes leverage. When leverage shifts, systems that relied on obligation lose influence. This is not rebellion, it is evolution. Systems that do not adapt to participant needs eventually lose participants. The long term implications of this shift will unfold gradually. Social structures will adjust, expectations will recalibrate, some things will be lost, new things will emerge. But one thing is certain: men who have found peace in disengagement will not trade it lightly. This is why attempts to shame, guilt, or pressure men back into participation fail. Those tools only work on people who are uncertain. Certainty neutralizes them. Men are certain about one thing now: their well being matters. That belief is foundational. It is also worth noting that disengagement does not make men unreachable, it makes them selective. They are open to environments that demonstrate fairness, respect, and stability consistently. What they are no longer open to are promises without structure and expectations without accountability. That selectivity is not cruelty, it is discernment. Discernment develops when people stop ignoring patterns. Men stopped ignoring patterns. The story being written now is not about conflict between men and women, it is about consequences of long term incentives. When incentives reward disengagement, disengagement grows. That is not ideology, that is human behavior. Understanding this does not require agreement, it requires honesty. Honesty begins by acknowledging that many men are not broken, lost, or confused. They are resolved. Resolution is quiet, it does not announce itself, it simply endures. So, as you think about everything discussed here, ask yourself whether the conversations you hear acknowledge that reality or continue to deny it. Denial prolongs confusion, acceptance allows adaptation. At this point, adaptation is the only realistic path forward, not to restore what was, but to understand what is. The sooner that understanding arrives, the less friction there will be in adjusting to the future. Men already adjusted. That is the part many missed. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed today? Do you agree with what is happening or do you see it differently? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter, and the future will be shaped by whether people are willing to speak honestly about them. Yeah, like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to the MWA, men walking away in cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.